in. I'm Andy Wahlberger, member of the board committee of the SREC, part of a company called Juniper Square, which is an investment management software company. We want to welcome all the SREC members to the second in a series of SREC-only broadcasts. In 2 weeks, we'll have the opportunity to hear from Joel Peterson on May 28th. As you know, Joel's come to speak to us before. He's the chairman of JetBlue, a former CEO of Trammell Crow, and a Stanford Business School professor, has a new book out on leadership. So stay tuned for that invitation. Today, we're really pleased to hear from Jeff DeBoer and in conversation with Dan Neidich. For the first portion of our broadcast, Dan and Jeff will have a discussion about policy implications for the real estate industry. Then we want to open up the conversation for a Q&A with the SREC audience. Most of you are getting familiar with Zoom protocol, but you can ask a question at any point during the conversation in the chat feature below. And Dan and Jeff will see those questions and may respond then or may take them a little later during the conversation. Then we're going to open it up to a Q&A where you can continue to ask chat or use the raise your hand function in the participant area. If you raise your hand, we can unmute you and you can audibly ask your question. So we really encourage your engagement. And when we call on you, you'll unmute and you'll be able, and I'll be on standby to assist as necessary. I'd like to introduce Jeff and Dan. Jeff is the founding president and CEO of the Real Estate Roundtable. The Real Estate Roundtable represents the leadership of the nation's 150 privately owned and publicly held real estate ownership, development, lending, and management firms, as well as the elected leaders of the 17 major national real estate industry trade associations. Jeff is regularly cited on power lists and most influential and top lobbyists in Washington, D.C. Back in October of 2017, Jeff came out to Stanford to address this SREC conference, and we appreciate his time with us today. And Dan Neidich, Dan is the CEO of Dune Real Estate Partners and has more than 25 years of opportunistic real estate investment experience and is one of the pioneers of real estate private equity. Prior to founding Dune, Dan built and led the team around the Whitehall Fund at Goldman Sachs. Dan was honored into the Real Estate Hall of Fame in 2017 and has been a great supporter of SPIRE and the SREC. Gentlemen, I turn the time over to both of you.
Okay. Why don't I start? And what Andy left out is I am also a former chairman of the Real Estate Roundtable, and so I've had the pleasure of working with Jeff for a number of years. And I would echo a couple of things, and Jeff will talk about the roundtable in a moment. But I would echo Andy's comments. Jeff really is one of the most wired people in DC. I think we are going to get a real sort of an inside look at what's going on in DC and especially how it affects our industry. You know, again, I think one of the great things about the Real Estate Roundtable is it leverages the members of the roundtable who are the leaders of the real estate industry to effectively promote the industry's activities with Washington, D.C. And one of the things that I think is unique about the roundtable is it's very focused. It has one goal, and that is to work with Washington. You know, a number of us are members of a lot of other organizations that have multiple issues and strategies and whatever. And I think one of the things that makes the roundtable so effective is that it really has only one job, and that is to work with Washington, D.C. I'm going to let Jeff maybe just talk for a moment about, you know, what are the things that the roundtable is working on now? What are its major priorities? And then we'll get into some, you know, kind of what I would think are a little more, maybe some of the more interesting questions that we might all have for Jeff. So with that, maybe just give us a brief introduction in terms of what is the roundtable doing and what do you see as the most important things that you need to be working on?
Thanks, Dan. And good morning, everyone. I know it's early on the West Coast. Thank you for tuning in and listening. I think it's a very, very important time for everybody to be focused and aware Well, it's always an important time to be focused and aware about what Washington is doing, but right now I think it's critical. I've got this background up of Martin Luther King's 1963 speech during the March on Washington, and it's become famous or well known for urging civil rights, but really the original intent behind the March on Washington was to end economic inequality and expand opportunities for everyone. And I think that if nothing more comes out of this situation that we're all in now, is the need to all of us work together to narrow the inequalities, the economic inequalities, and promote opportunities. And so point number one, Dan, I've always thought, and it was drilled into me by you and a number of other roundtable leaders early on, is that our industry is as strong as the people around the industry. It's as strong as the communities, and we have to be aware of all of that, and we need to help everybody, all businesses, all communities to be strong, and that will enable our industry to be strong. So point number one is, what are we doing at the Real Estate Roundtable? We are continually trying to make that connection between healthy real estate and strong communities and strong property tax bases and the ability for cities and states to meet the service needs of their population. So, we don't look at these issues, and all we do, Dan, as you well know, is work in Washington on national policy issues, working with Congress and the administration. And I am not running around town I'm not running around town at all now, but when I did run around town, I was not focused on how I could make more money for people in the real estate industry or how they could be more successful. But I was focused on the assets, and we represent all the various food groups, if you will, so office buildings, lodging, multifamily, industrial, and so on and so forth. And we look at these issues from the asset out, and we think if we can get policies that make these assets grow and be healthy over time, then we think it's good for all the participants around that asset. And that enables us to have office people working side by side with retail, side by side with multifamily, side by side with industrial, because—
And Jeff,
Yes,
and I think one of the things that you've really pushed forward have been working with the other trade groups, the ICSC, BOMA, the National Housing Council, and maybe talk a little bit about how that all works.
Yeah, I mean, we sort of, I mean, in many ways it's a pyramid, and in some ways at the top of the pyramid are the Dan Neidichs of the country, who leaders in the industry from all the different aspects of the industry. And then these trade associations, and there's 18 national trade associations that represent and do a great job for their parochial interests and product types. And what we try to do is bring them together to have a common voice and a common message on issues here in Washington. And it's clear when our industry hangs together, when urban supports suburban and retail supports office, and on and on and on, this is a very formidable industry and very powerful. But again, as long as we are talking about the benefits, not to ourselves, but to communities, which are very important and very strong. So we've been doing it for now 20 years, Dan, and we have a great success. We're in a very challenging time now. It's not the first time that we've had a challenging time, but it's pretty challenging right now for our industry and the economy, obviously.
And maybe talk a little bit about, obviously all of us read the papers, and so we're somewhat familiar with the different activities of the federal government in terms of dealing with the pandemic, but maybe connect it to what the federal government has been doing and how does that impact the real estate industry.
Yeah, and by the way, Dan, you very humbly said that you were a former chairman of the Roundtable. You were our chair during one of the really challenging time periods, 2009 to 2012. You chaired the
I probably blocked that out.
Well, you shouldn't, because in many ways that was one of our shining moments, really. I thought the Roundtable did a terrific job advocating different ways to help unclog the plumbing in the financial system at the time. Today, that's not really the case. This is not a financial system problem. This is credits were impaired back then because the financing was bad, because there was over leverage, because we all know all the reasons. Now, assets are impaired because income isn't coming streaming to those assets. And so Washington, in some ways, Washington has been slow to understand the differences between today's problems and the great financial crisis problems. And some of the proposals don't necessarily go to what I'm talking about, which is value impairment and income loss, and they instead go to liquidity and providing people with loans and so on and so forth. But having said that, I'm not criticizing at all what DC has done so far. I think they've been rather dramatic in the breadth and the swiftness that things have occurred. And so we have the Federal Reserve that has stood up a variety, or is in the process of standing up a variety of credit facilities. We've got the CARES Act that provided money to hospitals and states, and also the well-known Payroll Protection Plan, which is providing money to businesses that qualify to pay their employees. We've got an expanded unemployment program. We have stimulus checks going out and that kind of thing. And there's been a tremendous amount. I believe the estimate in the last month is over $500 billion directly to American people. And obviously they need this. The unemployment numbers today, I believe, are rivaling upper teens. In the Great Depression that peaked out at 25%. So we're in a big problem. But what has Washington done so far? The way that I've looked at it, Dan, is that it's like we originally thought, okay, we need a bridge to get through this period of stress and period of economic uncertainty. And so Congress had these programs that were much about almost putting the economy in a deep freeze for a few months and then unthawing it. I think now, and that's been good, I think, in many respects. We can criticize it here and there, but basically good. But now I think Washington is realizing that this is much more than a bridge back to normalcy. The normalcy that we're going to return to is not the normalcy that we left. And I think Washington is starting to understand that there's going to need to be both real stimulus. What's been done, I don't think, is stimulus. Again, it's a bridging function. But we're going to need real stimulus, and we're going to need real policies to help us go forward. So there's an evolution going on in DC. And the other evolution, and I'll stop, Dan, is just the evolution in bipartisanship and working together. I think early on, and part of the reason that so much was done early on so quickly was the coming together of ideological points of view and passing things quickly for the benefit of the country. And that is evolving. I don't want to overstate it, but it's evolving. People are going back to their old talking points and points of view on issues. And that's going to be a problem, I think, in some legislation going forward.
Can we just go through that a little bit more? Obviously all of us read in the papers, and it sounds like the Democrats and the Republicans hardly ever speak to each other. I know that a lot of these people, in a non-public manner. What do they say to you? What do you hear from them when you're speaking to them privately versus what we all read in their public announcements? And what are sort of the issues that you feel they feel differently about privately than what we hear publicly? And I'm a little surprised that you were as positive about Democrats and Republicans working together. I guess I would not have thought you'd have found as much bipartisanship as you just mentioned.
Well, what I'm talking about is that month in time when there was bipartisanship, and without it, let's face it, they did 3 or 4 bills, depending on how you want to count it, within a 6-month or a 6-week time period, basically. These were very big bills. And normally things like that. And if you look back at the great financial crisis, it took a while to get those safety valves and things put in place back then. And all I'm saying is I think that there was an early on coming together to do these bills, and now people are retreating a little bit more to their old corners. I don't want to overstate any kumbaya singing or anything like that. That wasn't going on. But what do people say? You know, that's a really interesting question. I was talking to 2 Democratic senators yesterday, and my point to them is that, you know, if you don't, the current policy in Washington appears to be that if you can get help elsewhere, if you're a public company, or if you're a well-capitalized private company, or if you have access to other forms of credit and capital, the policy here seems to be now that Washington doesn't want to help you. And so I'm raising those points with people on in telephone calls with senators and so forth. And here's a difference. Democrats, you won't hear say what they said to me on the phone yesterday, which was, yeah, we understand. We have to help a number of businesses, which may be public companies, or they may be well-known brand name companies that are going to be in serious trouble, and we need to help those companies. And they're saying that stuff privately, but not publicly. And that really goes to, you know, the politics of today and the hangover from the great financial crisis, where, you know, the view was that corporations got helped and people didn't. And now, so they want to reverse that and make sure people get helped and corporations don't. But from my perspective, if we do not start helping, obviously, we have to help people that have lost their jobs. We have to help companies that have shut their doors and so on and so forth. But we also have to provide the mechanism for these companies to be in position to hire people and to move forward once the economy goes reopens. Because if we don't, we're going to have a difficult enough time moving forward, and we don't need these companies burdened anymore. And so they say that. And the same on the Republican side. Republicans, you know, you see, you know, and maybe we'll talk about this, Dan, but like, for example, on the liability issue, you know, publicly, you know, you have lines being drawn in the sand on, you know, on these broad liability protections that Republicans basically want. But privately, they understand that this is going to be not a broad brush, but a different thing. So people do say things.
I think this liability issue is obviously a critical issue to any business that is going to open, whether it's mandated or not, or whether it's voluntary or whatever. What do you see as a possible compromise in the area of liability? Has anyone talked about, you know, I think we understand full liability, we understand no liability. What is in between?
Well, I think, you know, and that's the problem. You know, people want to go to the extremes. You know, the Democrats say, well, you know, business does not want to protect its employees. Well, that's not true. And Republicans say that there's going to be a litigation, a field day without this. Well, that's not true either. And I think that yesterday there was a hearing on a virtual hearing on the Hill, and it's starting to come out now what people are talking about. And really, no one is talking about being protected against gross negligence, or being protected of doing, just not caring or not protecting your employees or your workers or people that come in your buildings. People want standards, and they want to understand what do you expect us to do, okay? Whether it's by the way, hospitals, sports teams, businesses in general, mall owners, office building owners, everybody is now saying, we need a standard, and maybe that standard comes from Congress, or maybe it comes from OSHA or some other administrative way to do it. But basically,
and Jeff, do you think that standard has to be at a federal standard, or how do you see the relationship between the federal government and the states in a lot of these, and how it evolves?
Well, I think that's really a big point. I mean, the CDC or OSHA or someone will issue standards. Now, if you comply with those in some areas, maybe that's not enough. Maybe in New York City or in, you know, another very hotbed place, as they're called now, you need to do more. And I, you know, all of that will evolve. But again, there's got to be a connectivity between cities, states, and the federal government on what is expected of people. You know, if one building tests, you know, the temperature of somebody coming in and the building next door doesn't, does that mean that second building owner has somehow been negligent in providing safety? Well, I don't know. Maybe the other guy has gone an extra mile. Who knows? So the point again is just, you know, on liability, if we don't get these rules straight, it is going to be another anchor around the economy to go forward. And I think, despite the rhetoric of McConnell saying we got to have a broad-based thing and Schumer saying forget about it, I think the reality is they all know that we have to have something done here, and it may be administratively. The administration believes that it can do a number of guideline setting things through their rulemaking process. So, but it's a big issue, I think.
And let's turn to a subject you and I have talked about. You know, what do we do going forward in terms of protecting property owners from pandemics? And you know, I think a number of people think that that we should just sort of apply TRIA to pandemics, and maybe just spend a moment talking about TRIA, and which I think many people are aware of, but not maybe everyone. Talk about why it worked, how the constituencies were aligned, you know, the insurance companies, the unions, the property owners, the cities, and how is the pandemic different than the risks we all face that require terrorism insurance?
Yeah, in some ways it's a great parallel, and in some ways it doesn't work so well. But first of all, TRIA, I would mark TRIA as one of the really shining examples of what the roundtable and what organized real estate can do when we work together. I would say TRIA. I would also put, when you were chair, Dan, the great financial crisis response that we put together, and also the 2017 tax reform bill, as things where we really shined, so to speak. And the TRIA situation, prior to the 9/11 attacks, it was presumed that all risk coverage included a terrorist attack. After the attack, and that's what the litigation about with Silverstein and the insurers was all about. But after the attack, the insurance industry, primarily led by the reinsurance industry came out and said, we're not going to provide reinsurance to the direct insurers for terror cover because we can't actuarially measure how big the loss might be, when it might occur, how it might occur. You know, there's so many different ways for terrorists to strike, and it's sort of an asymmetrical situation in the sense that the government has information on terrorists, private insurance and private business doesn't. And so after 9/11, there was no longer going to be terrorism cover in an all-risk policy. Well, if you can't get all-risk coverage, a lot of transactions will stall. Construction will stall, urban areas will stall. And not only urban areas, because remember, much of real estate is owned and financed and put forward by pension plans and life companies and other investors that do not necessarily live in the urban areas. And so this was a big problem. We got together. We found a way to move forward with a TRIA, the Terrorism Risk Insurance Program. It's a function fine. The government is is a backstop for this insurance being offered, and things go forward. In this situation, it's a little bit different in the sense that pandemic problems were not part of any business interruption policy by and large. And so that's a different situation from the TRIA situation. But the result is the same. The insurance industry is not going to provide pandemic coverage in the capacity, the level of capacity that our economy needs. So a lot of us believe that we need a program where the government acts as the backstop, much like they do in terror, but not necessarily exactly like they provide in terror, but a backstop to give comfort and to give certainty to, particularly to lenders. Basically, we're talking about how can you finance a construction project? How can you finance the acquisition of a new property? How can you refinance a property? How can you undertake, by the way, how can you have a sporting event? How can you have meetings? How can you do so many things that require financing if the person or entity providing the financing is not comfortable with their risk? And particularly right now, because of the concerns of a second wave of the virus coming back, maybe in the fall or maybe in the winter or whatever. And so if we do now reopen and we expect people to return to normalcy, how in the world are people going to be able to return to normalcy if they don't have protection on their capital that they're investing and their credit that they're putting out? And so this is really, you know, this issue and the liability issue, I think, are sort of under the radar, but they are very, very important to getting our economy back. People talk about how are we going to get people to go on airplanes? How are we going to get people to go to restaurants or malls? Those are very important things, but they're sort of minor to the whole operation of the economy and the providing of credit. And liability and this insurance, I think, go to the heart of that. So we're working very hard on both
so
of those. And I'm optimistic on both, by the way.
Are we aligned with the insurance companies on this issue?
Yes and no. And it's similar again to TRIA. I mean, look, the insurance industry wants to make sure that TRIA, the internal guts and the plumbing of TRIA, don't inadvertently require them as insurers to do things that they don't otherwise want to do, or to assume too much of the risk, or to, you know, all kinds of things. We don't really care about that. We are consumers of the product. You know, we obviously at some point in time don't want those levers to be tightened too much on the insurers so they will leave the marketplace. But we also, you know, insurers, make sure that these things work for you so that you can provide the product to the economy so that we can all move forward. That's sort of our interest. And on TRIA, we stayed aligned, basically. At some points, we started to move apart a little bit, but not too much. And on this one right now, we are currently aligned. We have a meeting tomorrow with the property and casualty insurance industry to go over the type of proposal that we might all be able to get behind. And a lot of people think it's very simple. You just take terrorism out of TRIA and put in pandemic, but it really won't work that way because of the scope of the problem. Terrorism arguably was, you know, an event, and then you recover from the event. This is not an event. This is the basic cessation of income across America for everybody, and everybody's affected. And so it's a much bigger problem, and it involves we tried to get all industries and product types, hospitals, schools, etc., on TRIA. We were somewhat successful, but in this pandemic situation, everybody's in the same boat, I think, from the get-go, as they used to say.
Hey, Jeff, maybe talk a little bit about how is Washington, how is the Senate, the House, the people you're dealing with, how do they view our industry today? How well do they understand it? You know, does having a former, I say former from a long time ago, real estate developer as president, I'm careful, does that affect how people are, you know, how do they view it? I know that we came out of the 2017 Tax Act. You know, I think people perceived we were well treated. What is the tone as when Washington looks at our industry?
Well, let me start by saying the tone's better than it used to be, and by used to be, I would slap myself on the back and slap you on the back, because I think that prior to the Real Estate Roundtable, I think the industry really was viewed as a very parochial, very narrow-minded group of people who didn't even behave like an industry and were only concerned about their own little bottom lines. And part of what we did at the roundtable was, again, to shift the discussion away from personal benefits and toward communities and jobs and the benefits that the industry obviously provides. And over those 20 years, I think that we dramatically increased the brand name of the real estate industry in general. And I think that it was very, very good. Now, given the president being involved in the real estate industry and the vitriol and everything against the president that we see every single day, it's not helpful to what we're trying to do, because anytime that there is a provision in any bill that is deemed to be beneficial to real estate, people say it's being done for the president, which is really, really, really not at all close to reality. In fact, during the tax reform bill that you talked about, there were many provisions that we prevailed on that he and the administration were opposed to. And so it's more difficult, Dan, because the president is of the real estate industry. It makes it much more difficult for me to be public on urging things and so forth. And it makes it's a very, very touchy situation. On the other hand, members of Congress have been sensitized and understand, and there's more mayors and more governors and more people with experience at city councils that serve in Congress these days, and they're all familiar with the connectivity. Now, they also, just like all of us, have probably had our bad experiences with a landlord or a bad experience, with someone. And so there is that hangover, but I don't feel like we're certainly not shunned or anything like that. People listen to our points of view, and they listen to the roundtable, because when they see me, they actually see you, Dan, and they see through me, and they see our brand that we've established. So it's not as bad as it used to be.
Right, and just along those lines, the roundtable has a staff, but really leverages off people in the industry, takes them up to Capitol Hill, has them talk to their representatives, their senators, and I think it's one of the unique elements of the organization is that it really is member driven, managed by Jeff and his team, but still it is people, like people on this phone getting involved in, with their senators and Congress people.
Absolutely, and our policy committees, look, our policy committees are unbelievable. I mean, we do tremendous analysis and of issues and things, and I don't know anything about the real estate industry. I know what you tell me, and I know what our policy committees tell us, and I have to sort of sort it all out. But I think having a credible, long-term, we turned down, for example, expensing, much to the chagrin of some people in the industry. We turned down the ability to expense the construction or the acquisition of buildings back in the tax bill in 2017. And we did that even though we knew that it would be a tremendous short-term benefit to everyone in the industry. No one would pay taxes anymore. They'd be expensing everything, but people would be building buildings that we don't need. We'd be building buildings beyond the economics. Trades would be uneconomic. It would distort the marketplace. It would screw up balance sheets for lenders. And so for people that are long-term interested in a successful real estate industry, which is what we've branded ourselves as, it worked out well, and we said no to that at the time. Dan, it's not easy, and particularly given the inequality issues that are in the country that I started off talking about, and so forth. And we need to make sure that our industry is trying to find solutions. Energy efficiency, we want our buildings to be, and our tenants to be, more energy efficient. We want our buildings to be safe. We want communities to be healthy, and we just have to drive that point through and through.
You know, you and I had this conversation the other day as to McConnell's comment that, you know, we're done for a while, let's see how everything works out, and then we'll address whether there's another program that's needed. It sounds a little bit like there's some softening in that position. It sounds like there's more pressure on him. Just maybe talk a little bit about the dynamic. You know, where do he and or Pelosi, when do they respond to public opinion? When don't they? And how do you think about what is going to happen next in terms of the next program for dealing with this
yeah. Well, it kind of goes to the point that I was saying. I mean, people are retreating to their partisan lines of attack. A lot of these things that are in the press and everything really are negotiation points. I mean, nobody really believes some of the stuff that these guys say, and they are negotiating in a way. Senator McConnell did say, you know, we want to sit back and wait a little bit. He doesn't see the urgency. Now, I do think some of that was taken out of context. I mean, it makes sense. I think everyone would agree that it makes sense to find out who has not been helped and why from the legislation so far. Before we go throwing some more money out of helicopters across the country, shouldn't we understand where the money has been landing and why it hasn't been landing in other places and those things? So I think in some respects, what he and others are saying is, let's find out, let's see, let this settle a little bit and find out. That was taken the way it was taken. And in any event, I would expect that that another bill will probably be done by the end of June, maybe sooner than that, but by the end of June, I would certainly expect another big round of legislation. You saw the Speaker of the House put forward the Democratic $3 trillion proposal 2 days ago, focused on state and local governments, focused on hospitals, and by the way, it had a proposal that we're very keen on, dealing with rental assistance. So, you know, I think these things will come together. I think people are making statements that are more for public consumption, not necessarily for getting the job done here, and they'll come together. I think I'm optimistic.
Hey, Jeff, I think we want to open it up for questions, but okay. Make one more comment on what you just mentioned here a moment ago, getting tenants help.
Yes. And
I think this has been a program that the Roundtable has been pushing, yeah, and maybe has some traction.
Dan, yeah. Before Jeff answers that question, just reminding the crowd to prepare their questions either through chat or raising their hands, and we'll audibly call on them following Jeff's response. Thanks.
Yeah, and I'm sorry, I probably burned up too much time before, but yeah, the rent thing. Look, if
maybe explain what the program is that you've envisioned, that the Roundtable has been working on.
Okay. Well, first of all, we believe that what we call the rent obligation chain is a big foundational underpinning of the economy and the financial system. It's not just a landlord who is not getting his or her rent. That rent is used to pay for maintenance workers. It pays for security in buildings. It pays for the utilities in the building. It pays for the taxes. It pays the debt service on it, and it provides money to the investors, and many of these investors are pensioners or 401k people and retirees and so on and so forth. And once that chain is broken, as it has been now, that is a very serious threat to the economy and the financial systems, at least in my opinion, and I think, in a lot of people's opinions. Values are very much obviously determined by rent. If we can't have true value discovery, price discovery, how can you do trades? How can you make investments? How can you do anything? And so we want to reinstate that chain if we can. And but we understand that politically, nobody's going to be writing checks from the government to landlords. That just doesn't seem to be a politically acceptable thing to do. And so we have to help tenants. We have to help people. We have to help businesses. We need to restore that rental chain during the time period that they can't make the payments. And so in the House bill that Speaker Pelosi has introduced a couple days ago, and in a bill that Senator Sherrod Brown has put forward with 28 Democratic senators on it last week, there would be a fund established for residential renters. They would apply to the fund much like the PPP. They would file a certificate that says that, certification that says that they've been negatively impacted by the virus. They cannot pay their rent. The applicable agency would review that certification, and they would then, if it was true, they would pay the rent to the landlord on behalf of the tenant, and on through the obligation chain it would go, and it would be very helpful, but it's only confined to the residential side of things. By the way, I mentioned I talked to a Democratic senator yesterday, and he called me and he said, so did you write the bill or just edit it? And I laughed, and then he said, so how do you feel about the bill? And I said, well, you're a senator, so this isn't the first time you're going to hear this, but it's good, but not good enough. And my point to him was, we have to help business tenants pay their rent as well as individuals. Certainly individuals need help, but so do businesses. And as a matter of fact, oddly enough, the collection rate or rent payment rate on the multifamily apartment side of things so far, is not a disaster. It's not good, but it's not a disaster. About, in the low 80%, I believe, rent collections in May for multifamily. Meanwhile, in the covered retail space, it's in the teens. In the overall retail space, it's below 50%. In the office situation, it's in the upper 70s. And so there's a big problem of rent payment and businesses being able to pay on the business side. And so we want to restore that. And I'm optimistic about that. They've put $100 billion on the table now for residents, and they want to use that to cover a 6-month period. If you run through all of the numbers and everything, that basically means that it would reimburse about 30% of all residential rental people for a 6-month period. We need a similar program on the business side, and people are slowly aware of this. I think in some ways, and then I'll stop, Dan, and we'll take the questions. I think that this is sort of a political ploy as well. The Democrats, they want to put out the residential rental housing assistance program. They fully expect the Republicans to counter. The Republicans are either going to say, no, we're not going to do it, or no, we're going to expand it to businesses. I don't think they're going to say, no, we're not going to do it. And so we're in a pretty good position, I think, on all of this, but we shall see, and politics will come along. But it's critical. And I'll tell you, this is my call to action to the industry. We have to absolutely start talking to members of Congress about this rental chain problem, not just from the residential side, because that's clearly understood, but from the business side as well. Thanks.
Okay. Open it up to questions or comments or agreements, disagreements.
And by the way, I just want to end by saying, look, I know Dan is the guy. These are the people that help us understand policy. And when we're running, so many organizations in Washington, D.C. continue to push things because they push them. And it was on their agenda 5 years ago, and they're going to put it on their agenda. We are extremely dynamic. We change. If we did it last year and we don't need it this year, fine, we're not going to do it anymore. And that's because of leaders like Dan and Bob Lowe is also a Stanford alum, I believe, and a number of other people, Fred Allen from the legal point of view, and a lot of people who have helped us think through things. And that allows us to be pretty nimble and pretty flexible. But it's all because we listen to our membership, and members of Congress listen to us for that.
Dan, as we kind of gather the questions of people that are interested, I've got one question for you, Jeff, is from a citizen, we've observed whether it was healthcare standards or stay-at-home standards have been somewhat decentralized based on governors. Governor Cuomo doing this, Governor Newsom doing this, the governor in Florida doing that. And maybe you can talk about the federal versus state and those standards or coordination as it relates to real estate or forbearance or some of these things that you're working through that may be on a federal level versus a state or local community level.
Yeah, well, I mean, I think, now maybe I'm going to sound cynical on this, but I think that regardless of how this was approached, it was going to be heavily criticized. If the administration had a nationwide stay-at-home or a nationwide this or that, the criticism would have come, well, each locality is different, states and should be able to decide, governors have the authority, governors should be managing their states. So, okay, they did it this way, and now there's a lot of criticism, the other side of the coin. Our country's extremely enormous. It's extremely diverse. It's extremely geographically different. And we're not Italy. We're not, it's different. And so I guess we can criticize the governors Cuomo doing this and Newsom doing that and DeSantis doing this and Pritzker doing that in Illinois. But frankly, I think the governor, who knows better about their states than governors? Now, there should be the overriding standards coming from the Washington, and they kind of did that, and then they sort of backed away from it, of course. President wants to have it always. And I don't know how to answer that question other than we'll see how all of this works out. I mean, Texas seems, I don't know, Texas is out there pretty much wide open, but I do understand there's additional cases there. And then you look at Europe, look at what happened in Europe, or other places around the world, South Korea, where the economy was reopened, but now new cases are developing. I think Brazil is having a big problem now, reopening, and so they're going to have to retrench a little bit. And I don't know. I don't know how to answer it other than it's a problem, but what's the solution here, given the diversity and the geographic spread of the United States? I just think it'd be very hard to mandate from Washington to anybody's.
Thank you, Jeff. We have a question here, Dan, that's in the chat, and I'll just read it from David Kelly. Will more be done to publicize the volume of delinquent rental payments as even non-commercial actors understand the immediacy of loss or occupancy and the follow-on effects to society and the economy? Won't this build support for a stabilization fund?
Jeff?
Well,
I would think as the REITs are reporting and more of this becomes public, it'll give you the data and the ammunition to argue the case you're making.
And there is some, on the commercials, the residential data is a little bit easier to get than the commercial data, lo and behold. But there are some trackers that are now going public with rates of pay rent on the commercial side, and I think they're going to get more and more coverage. And of course, if these servicers, the CMBS servicers and stuff, if predictions are true and one of those blows up, that will certainly get a lot of attention. But maybe what you're talking about is it just going to be publicized so people know which companies are experiencing this or not.
Well, and I think to understand the extent of the issue. Yeah, I'm not sure. Does Congress really appreciate, the amount of non-payment of rent?
I don't. By the way, they're slowly coming to it on this. They're slowly coming. What they don't understand really is the amount of opportunistic tenants there are who may be taking a little bit of an advantage of this situation. I don't want to overstate it, but I do think there's some of that. I think the combination, the non-payment of rent, I think, is probably three things. Some businesses have been shuttered and just don't have the money, and some businesses are being opportunistic, and some smaller businesses, they're doing what I think all of us do when we're afraid of the future, and that is they're hoarding. Maybe hoard's the wrong word, but they're conserving their cash, and they're looking around because they don't know what the future holds. And so all three of those things, and it has to be publicized. You're right.
There's one more question here from Dave Butler, and I'll just read it here. Do you foresee any legislation helping CMBS borrowers to more easily work with servicers for forbearance?
Yeah. Well, first of all, they've already, let's set aside residential CMBS because the Fannie Mae and Freddie Mac have their policy is essentially to provide the capital for the servicers to meet the investors, the call on the income. But on the commercial side, now I forgot what I was going to say. There have been some things done. First of all, the government has sort of said, you're on your own, point number one. How long that lasts, we shall see. But they have acknowledged that many of those loans in the CMBS pool and in the REMIC trust need to be modified and restructured. Under current tax law, you can't do that. If you modify significantly, as probably everybody on this call knows, if you modify the loans significantly in the pool, then you'll blow the pool up and the REMIC will lose its tax exempt status, and on it goes. Because the government, IRS, and Treasury have issued notices to provide relief in that area, so there can be more substantial material modifications within the pool without causing some big tax problem. So they've been flexible there. And I guess now that I'm talking about the IRS and Treasury, before I lose the thought, there's also been a number of very positive, under the radar screen, I think, very positive that we've urged, very positive rulings on dates that you have to meet your 1031 exchanges, or investment, roll over the gain to get into an opportunity zone investment or stuff like that. The government has, provided, a degree of flexibility there, and there will be more coming, and there will be more action on cancellation of debt income, COD, under Section 108 of the tax code. There will be more action there, and it will come, if that answers your question. I mean, this servicing thing, there was a pretty decent bipartisan group of senators who wrote to the Secretary of Treasury regarding the problem in the servicer area, and didn't really accomplish much. I would add this, though. I believe that in the House bill early on, maybe it dropped out on its way to the floor, which sometimes happens, but there was going to be a pool, a fund that the House Democrats were thinking about for servicers, a fund for servicers, a fund for mom and pop troubled landlords was going to be in there, and a residential tenant fund. So, you know, these things are bouncing around, but until one of these servicers I hate to say it that way, but you know, crises does get attention, and predicting the crisis maybe doesn't get as much attention as it should, unfortunately.
Jeff and Dan, there's a couple questions. I think we just have time for one more. This one came up in the Q&A section. It's a little longer, so I'll read it here. But it reads, so this is a massive business interruption loss event for the whole economy amounting to a few $1 trillion. The costs that are being currently spread randomly. There are two sources to cover the loss. One, savings, personal and fiscal, and two, loans for the future. The federal and state government have no fiscal savings. Aren't savers already paying an unfair share of making good on their rent? Is there really a way in such an event to eliminate the penalization of savings and financial preparedness? You understand go ahead, Jeff.
You wanted that down? Oh, Dan's got. You're right. I mean, I think you're right. These losses are enormous. In many ways, they have been incurred to benefit the health and safety of the citizens of the country. And now the United States government seems to be telling an awful lot of people that, dig into your back pocket and bear this loss. I personally think that's wrong myself, and it's the first time that the government has ever done that. They've never instituted a rule like this, but that seems to be the situation right now. And so they are requiring people to go into their savings, to go into their retirement accounts, to tap other lines of credit that they may have that they haven't pulled down, to go, if you're a corporation, to go to the public markets and issue debt to cover those losses that arguably were incurred for the safety and soundness of our citizens and every one of us. Again, I think it's not right, but that is the program right now. Having said that, it's not like Washington has turned its back on the American public. They've directly spent about $3 trillion already. Some of that money that went to the Treasury Department to stand up the Fed facilities are then levered 10 to 1. And so arguably the government is providing $6 to $7 to $8 trillion worth of assistance to the country. That's pretty significant when the overall GDP of the country is 21 trillion. So Washington's stepping up. Do they need to do more? Absolutely. Will they do more? Yes. Will it be in the right ways? We'll see. And the problem on the last question, in the right ways, is will politics start to overtake and people will be pushing their agenda that they've had for years and years on this or that, and using this crisis as a way to accomplish those goals, or will we be able to keep the political minds focused on the real problem, getting through this situation and moving the country forward? And I think it's up to all of us to try and make sure that the policymakers do the latter and avoid being political, avoid picking winners and losers, avoid the partisan back and forth on things that could really long-term make this a worse problem than it's going to be anyway.
Thank you, Jeff, for your response. And Dan, thank you for...
By the way, you guys, Jeff promised that he was going to end optimistically. So that was optimistic.
I love it.
Well, it is. Hey, look, let me put it this way. Dan, well, let me put it to you, Dan. How many crises have you been through? Okay, probably, let's start with I would just say, okay, the 1990s credit crisis. Then you had the telecom bubble burst. Then you had 9/11. Then we had the great financial crisis. And every single time, our country and our politicians respond and we do the right thing. Churchill had it right. You know, America tries everything until we get it right, and we'll get it right, and everything will be okay. But it's going to be a big, big difference. And real estate is going to be at the forefront of this, because we're going to be so critical in how social distancing is dealt with, how offices, or how do you feel going into your office? How do you feel going into your mall? After 9/11, people said, oh my God, nobody will ever get on a plane again. Oh, really? Well, they did. And people now are saying, well, God, I can't go to a baseball game again. Oh, okay, well, we'll probably do that. And so, yeah, I'm pretty optimistic about it. Dan, aren't you?
Yeah, I am. I'm fine. And look, thank you for doing this. And Andy, I know we overstayed a little bit, but
well, we appreciate it. Thank you. Thank you for going into overtime. Dan, thank you for moderating and hosting this discussion. And Jeff, thank you especially for your time and all you're doing for our industry.
Thank you.
Thanks to our SRAC members. We'll catch up with you in a couple of weeks, and have a great day.
Thanks.
Peace and love.
Bye.
Bye-bye.